Okay, I was saying thank you very much for inviting me to share my research that I have been engaging with over the years, more particularly for the last 3 years since 2020 up to date. I have been working in the Bidibidi refugee settlement, but also in Kampala urban refugee neighborhoods, recollecting on refugee peace initiatives and also humanitarian activities that they engage in. I just want to say a very brief background about me before I go into the slides. My early childhood I spent it in a refugee camp that was in South Sudan. And since then, I have aligned my research and my engagements within refugee neighborhood to the wider well-being of refugees, but also to let know also or maybe enlighten on how refugees engage on their everyday activities. So I completed my master's thesis. My master's thesis was in Uganda that captured the internal displaced persons. Many of you, the masters I have been teaching as well as doing research among refugees until then I got this project. But there are also other partners we have in Somalia and then as well as in Sri Lanka. But also more importantly, after the aid account, and then as I said earlier, I developed this idea to look at how refugees contribute to peace. And then I was able to write a project proposal to the Peace Research Institute. And I'm very grateful for the International Peace Research Association that funded a lot of the research that actually leads to this particular presentation. So I will then now move from there to my context. South Sudan has had a very turbulent history right from independence, from when it got independence from the 1950s. It was still under the wider Sudan, but the years that followed up to 2006, South Sudan had had very series of coups and a lot of struggle for self-independence. But in 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed, which allowed for power sharing between the northern part of South Sudan, which is greatly the Arab North, and then you have the African North. And this comprehensive peace agreement allowed South Sudan to, and then in 21, go for a referendum. And indeed, they went for referendum, and through the referendum, South Sudan got independence. But immediately, 2 years after the independence, South Sudan and then was engulfed into civil strife. And this would later on influence much of my discussions, basically on power sharing agreement between the two dominant tribes in South Sudan, that is the Dinka and the Nue, and the Dinka are the majority and the Nue more or less like the majority. So this power sharing agreement failure to strike a deal led to the 2013 crisis, which would then eventually culminate into the 2016 South Sudan refugee crisis. Now, in 2016, a large number of South Sudanese then had to go to the neighboring countries. Uganda offered one of the very central areas because also Uganda is very near to South Sudan. I will share some maps later on. And many of the refugees then came to the northern part of Uganda as well as in the West Nile region. But more specifically in Bidibidi settlement, of all the 9 settlements that were opened to accommodate the South Sudanese in 2016, Bidibidi refugee settlement was the largest, and it accommodated the biggest number of South Sudanese refugees. By 2016, I think it was the largest settlement in the world, but by today it's the 3rd largest in Africa. If you can move to the next slide. So this is a brief map of Bidibidi refugee settlement. If you can see, this is Uganda, and Bidibidi refugee settlement is marked with red. And on the northern part here is the South Sudan. And therefore, as the civil strife started in South Sudan, most of the South Sudanese refugees ideally then moved into Uganda, and Uganda hosts the largest population. But Bidibidi refugee settlement is located in the Yumbe district, and the area that is called Bidibidi is largely a semi-arid area with the rocky terrain. For the host community, Until the influx of refugees, it was considered as a hunting ground and fertile for agriculture. And I think that's why it was very easy for it to be designated as a refugee settlement. But then its terrain and then the infertile soils and so on will influence refugee livelihoods and well-being in the settlement. That I will also talk a little bit on later. If you can move to the next. So within the Bidibidi refugee settlement, what really makes the tribal configurations? More interested in the tribes because the conflict in South Sudan is mostly fought along tribal lines. And whatever happens in Sudan and then comes and reflects itself in the Bidibidi refugee settlement of Uganda. Much of the refugees that are in Bidibidi come from the Greater Equatoria, and on this map of South Sudan, the Greater Equatoria is just in the southern part of the South Sudan, and it's closely adjacent to the border between Uganda and Sudan, South Sudan itself. And the tribes that occupy this are mostly the Acholi, the Kaya, and so on. And these tribes are also then reflected in Bidibidi. Bidibidi has over 46 tribes. And these tribes continue to fight each other. They continue to have disputes because it relates greater to what really is in South Sudan, and then it is reflected in the Bidibidi refugee settlement. But also, and then you have the host community. The Aringa people, the Aringa have close relationships with the South Sudanese, most of the South Sudanese tribes, especially the Baka. The Aringa trace their origin from South Sudan and the greater equatorial region of South Sudan. So you have these historical, economic, and intertribal relations that have persisted. And when South Sudan civil war started, it was very easy for the Ringa people to then host the South Sudanese in their land. So why then the struggle for resources if you have the South Sudanese are settled, but then what really brings the struggle for resources? First, when the settlement was designated, Uganda brought up the settlement mentality. The idea was to usher South Sudanese or refugees in Uganda to self-reliance. Uganda manages and South Sudan, refugees through a number of policies. You have the 2006 Refugee Act, you have the 2010 Refugee Regulations, and then more recently in 2018, Uganda implemented the UNHCR Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. But also Uganda is a signatory to international human rights conventions. And because of these policies, the idea of the settlement was that refugees are allocated a piece of land, which ideally measures 30 by 30 meters, in which they are supposed to set up their household, but then use that piece of land as for subsistence agriculture. The idea is that from 2016, maybe 5 years later on, through that subsistence agriculture, refugees are supposed to be ushered to NC state. However, the land allocated to refugees and Uganda's settlement governmentality have largely remained contested. A lot of scholars have argued that the land itself is insufficient to take refugees to self-reliance. But also in then the rocky terrains, most of the refugees are settled in unfertile lands, which are not even very ideal for agriculture. So the narrative of self-reliance and then what the realities on the ground contradict actually what is on the policy. However, also in 2020, when I started the field work, what became eminent was the COVID-19. Added to the infertility of the land, and then the COVID-19 exacerbated resource struggles in the Bidibidi refugee settlement. With the COVID restrictions, many of the refugees were not able to move out to do other income generating activities. They were confined in the settlements, and many of them went back to South Sudan, but many also remained. But to those who remained, and then there was the need for them to access resource beyond the settlement. So you have this resource struggle within the settlement as well as a resource struggle outside the settlement in the host communities. But also this struggle for resources is also reflective of what is happening in South Sudan. As I said, more recently, the 2022 civil war is still being fought on tribal lines, and this is reflected back in the Bidibidi refugee settlement, because you have these different tribal configurations who fight each other and they point fingers to each other and say, okay, you are the cause of our displacement. If it was not for your tribe, and then we will not be coming into this settlement. We are suffering because of this. So you have these tribes pointing each other, the fingers to each other, tribes fighting each other within the settlement. But more lately in 2013, no, I mean 2023 in July, and this had started a long time ago, World Food Program reduced food ratios to refugees in the settlement. From the 100% food ratio, eventually, most of the refugees now get 30%. Now, the 30% food ratios really makes it very difficult for refugees to earn a meaningful livelihood. And that means then they really have to rely on land resources. And these resources in the settlement ideally cannot be enough for them, and many of the refugees then go out. So you have these intra tribal conflicts as well as the intertribal conflicts, but also then conflicts that come up within the host community. So within these cross struggles, I will look specifically into two contexts. If you can move to the next. So the context I will look at, the first is the refugee conflicts. How do they really manifest themselves in the Bidi settlement? And then secondly, I will look at the refugee host conflicts. Both of them might interlace, but then they have their own unique characteristics. So I will start with the refugee conflicts. So refugee conflicts manifest themselves in the settlement based on either intertribal conflicts where one tribe fights the other, or they can reflect themselves within the same tribe fighting for each other, fighting amongst each other. So for the intertribal conflicts, the Dinka and the Nue are more or less in Bidi settlement looked at as the cause of displacement, and the rest of the tribes more or less don't like them, and that breeds a lot of tension for the Dinka and the Nue. But also besides that, and then you have the water conflicts, which can both be inter and intra within the different tribes. And this photo I've taken on the right here reflects one of the struggles. This is a water point, a borehole, and this was during July, and by then it was a rainy season. But when we went in January, the lines for the jerrycan to access the water would be just long, and it could take somebody hours to access water. Women and children would go like around at 3 a.m. for you to be able to access water by 7 a.m. in the morning. So you have these water point struggles where and then refugees engage in conflict fights with each other, but also and then during the dry season, especially during the months of January, the wells dry up, and when the wells dry up, then refugees start struggling with the host community to access water that they can find out anywhere else. And this really and then takes the conflict to another dimension. But besides water, you have the fuel wood struggles, firewood collection, and so on, refugees fighting among each other for firewood within the settlement. But also more importantly, the disputes that arise for the struggle for men and women. Now, Bidi refugee settlement is 80% women and children, and there are very few men. So you have women struggling to access men, maybe if I can say snatching other women's men and so on. So that kind of struggle really creates a lot of tension for the women, but also then the men engage in the same practice. It might seem a little bit an obvious thing, but then it's really a very huge struggle for many of the refugees. Most of the husbands, my participants, most of the women narrated that their husbands are in South Sudan. They continue to fight in the war. So for them, for the women and children, they are in the settlement for safety, and yet the husbands are there. So this gender imbalance really creates a very big problem in the settlement. If you can move to the next. I just got this extract, and this is one of the extract that tries to exemplify the intertribal conflicts. And this was one of the participants from the Dinka tribe. For him, he said, I'm a Dinka, and there are a few of us here. That was in 2021, and actually in the settlement, he was the only one. And he said that I'm the only one here in the village 8. Sometimes living alone as a Dinka is scary, and other tribes consider us as the Dinka the cause of their displacement. So that was in 2021. But when I went back in 2022, I also interacted with him in a follow-up interview, and he had called 2 and 3 of their friends to join him in the settlement. Now, 2023, when I went back, the number of the Dinkas actually is now increasing. There were more than now 30 in the settlement. But you can compare this to over 250,000 other refugees who are living in the settlement. So the Dinka having this tension. So it illustrates this intertribal conflict that is within the settlement, and that really reflects how refugees fight each other in the settlement. Besides the refugee conflicts, and then you have this context of the refugee host. So the refugee host conflicts, basically, one of the major sources is the land that refugees are located based on the refugee policies of Uganda. The 30 by 30 ideally is not enough. So most of the refugees try to go out and access land into in the host communities. Access of land is normally an informal basis. There are no legal laws in Uganda that try to guide refugees from accessing land beyond the settlement. But within the settlement, it's okay, it's guided by the policies, but outside, without the settlement, and then it becomes very, very difficult. So refugees engage in this kind of informal arrangements of land, and in these informal arrangements, most of them feel cheated by the host community in land agreements. And to them, that becomes a major source of conflict. But also, besides that, you have this firewood collection. You can see on the photo on the right here, these are young girls who have gone to collect firewood. Firewood is a major source of energy for the refugees and the hosts alike, and therefore they struggle for this wood fuel. And to get it, sometimes for the refugees, they have to go into the host community, and going there then means that you have to fight with the host community, because also the host want to get the firewood and sell it to the refugees in the settlement, as well as refugees want to access it without payment. So you have these firewood, fuelwood struggles. And other conflicts arise from collection of fruits, wild fruits. Many of the refugees go into the host community to collect wild fruits, charcoal burning, and stray animals, especially during the farming season, that is the wet season, where both in the settlement and outside the settlement, you can find those who keep animals like goats, cows, and so on, can leave them, and then the animals destroy the crops. And these become very, very major sources of conflict for the refugees and hosts. This is also another extract I got, and this participant tried to illustrate the dilemma in the land hire system. He said that when someone hires land from the host community, the agreements are normally not honored. You rent land for 3 years, but after clearing the booths in the first year, the landlords normally end the hire agreement. And ending the hire agreement, most of the refugees and then feel cheated, and this breeds tensions, and sometimes there are outright fights between the hosts and the refugees. So within this context, the refugee host conflicts and the refugee conflicts, what are some of the initiatives? So to me, I was more interested now in looking at how do refugees respond to this. If you can move to the next slide. I will explore this within 2 contexts, where refugees struggle and try to engage in peace building. I will look at one organization. This organization is referred to as the Peace and Conflict Resolution Organization. But I will also look from the humanitarian perspective how refugees then engage in provision of humanitarian assistance, and based on their socio-cultural practices, how do this then influence peace building processes? These 2 will then make me end the presentation. If you can go to the next. So this is PACRO. PACRO is an acronym that stands for Peace and Conflict Resolution Organization. It was also started in 2020 at the plight of the coronavirus, at the height of the coronavirus, because of these resource conflicts. It is initiated by the refugees, but also supported by the hosts. So you have equal membership between the refugees and the hosts. The idea of this is to try to solve this water access conflicts, but also how do we manage resource fruit gathering? How do we manage gathering of vegetables and so on. So realizing that you have these conflicts, parkouring then comes up, initiated by the refugees, but then with the support from the host, you have this very communal management of conflicts. So parkour basically engages, if you can go to the next, parkour's activities center most in peace building efforts. They do this through sensitization campaigns. When I went there for the last field work, I participated in I was a participant in one of their sensitization campaigns in peace building. It was among the host community, but not in the settlement. But also parkour engages in conflict resolution, especially informal arrangements of conflict resolution, engagement and involvement of council of elders, women leaders, and so on. Parkour offers alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, but also then widely engages in dialogue and the distribution in conflict management. Because of the activities of parkour has gathered support from IRC. Specifically, IRC supports much of the initiatives of parkour. And where I went, actually, it was IRC that sponsored it. And other organizations like the Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda also supports parkour's activity. So parkour ideally engages in managing both, although their primary focus is the refugee host conflicts, they also have this influence on managing the refugee conflicts as well. So to me, that such initiatives, I think, attracts quite a lot of attention. If you can go to the next. And the next is this property recovery. Property recovery scheme is a scheme that's majorly started by women. It's an effort where women gather and they do savings. The savings initiative borrows greatly from the South Sudanese culture of sharing. So the women believe that based on their culture of sharing, they can sit together, save some money, and as well as then use this money either to empower their members or do other productive activities. But also this RABITA, or the property recovery, is also informed widely by the activities of mainstream humanitarianism or professional humanitarianism, whether it is Save the Children, Caritas, and so on, who have always emphasized saving schemes among refugee populations. Refugees combine their culture of sharing together with these initiatives of the international humanitarian organizations of savings to then start what they refer to as property recovery, where each group member supports the other members either through savings, but also emotionally, psychologically. And it started within the refugee settlement, but the women in the refugee settlement have extended this property recovery to also incorporate women from the host community. In my 3-year fieldwork, I have been very lucky enough, because every other month they normally have this giveaway ceremonies, and some of the property recovery you can see on the right, women can buy in a month. When after the savings, you can buy a lot of materials such as flasks, you can buy mattresses, you can buy corrugated iron seats, you can do thatching, you can pay school fees, and a lot of other initiatives. And these initiatives really go handy in ameliorating conflicts among the South Sudanese refugees themselves, but also it is an avenue to extend peace building efforts beyond the settlement. It breeds an atmosphere basically of unity among the refugees as well as the hosts. So this was the chairperson who actually underscored the importance of parkour, and she illustrates how parkour has been, the property recovery scheme, that is the RABITA, has been very, very instrumental in uniting women within the settlement to solve the issues of fighting for husbands, as well as also the issue of men fighting for women, but also extending how RABITA and this property recovery scheme is a uniting force for the women in the settlement as well as in the host community. These are, to me, these are one of the core, these were the two core initiatives that I thought I could talk a little bit about. But although these initiatives look very appealing and they're very promising, one thing that I realized in the discussions and engagements with the participants was that much of these activities are small-scale initiatives and they have limited coverage. Especially PACROS activities are only limited in Zone 1 of Bidibidi settlement, and yet Bidibidi settlement has 5 zones. That disadvantages the other zones. But also, and then these activities are rarely sustainable. Now, for PACRO and the property recovery scheme, they have lasted for as far as since 2020 up to date. But there are a lot of other similar initiatives that have come up, but eventually just disappear before reaching their first birthdays. And then you have this very limited support from the settlement governmentality. You have the Office of Prime Minister, Uganda's agency responsible for refugee welfare does not really support these initiatives much. And there are very limited activities and engagements from the UNHCR and other international non-governmental organizations, save for those other projects that like IRC implements within the refugees. However, for me, the core discussion here, the core reflection here is, despite the shortfalls, these refugee initiatives and many others that can be seen in settlements could offer a potential for us to reimagine peace processes in protracted crisis specifically. And instead of looking at refugees as recipients of peace, I think these two cases and many others in other settlements provide us a very, very good opportunity to actively engage in conflict, to understand various ways of conflict management and resolution. I will then end there with my presentations, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for an interesting, enlightening presentation. We look forward to seeing the results of your PhD in the future. I'd like to invite Awal Mohamud to take to the digital floor to present his reflection on this and perhaps give us a bit of an introduction into how the Diaspora Policy Research Centre operates and what he has learned from working with diaspora for, I think it's now decades.
Thank you very much, Tom, and also thank you, Emmanuel, for your excellent presentation, but also shared with us the case study of South Sudan, which is really very important. As Tom said already, my name is Awal Mahmoud. I'm the director of the African Diaspora Policy Center, which is based in The Hague, and I've been running the foundation for more than now 15 years, Tom. It's more than 10 years. So, yeah, and I will be focused. My response will be very limited, but I will focus on the two aspects that Emmanuel talked about it, which are really very big themes: diaspora humanitarianism and diaspora peace building. According to our research, diaspora, although they are not on the ground, they're still involved in what's happening in their origin countries. What we call them, they are emotional attached. So there's always that emotional attachment, which also leads them to engage in different ways. In terms of humanitarian intervention, we did a number of research, really looking at how diaspora contribute to the humanitarian intervention in times of crisis, when crises happen, whether it's Ebola or whether it is COVID or whether it's earthquake. And we have seen that diaspora use what we call a number of instruments to really increase awareness in wherever they are located. The first is what we call advocacy instrument. So really they try to engage with local institutions, with local NGOs, especially in the host countries, with the media, with the civil society, is awareness of what's happening, because the first responders, when something happened back home, they are much easy to know what's happening with the different target groups in the host countries. They also use what we call political instrument to influence the policy towards what happens, or they visit the parliament. So they also use, or even petition. So they try also to influence the policy actors in the countries they are located, in the host countries. They also use what we call transnational networking instruments, because diaspora are located in different places. So really they try to link up the diaspora from the same countries, where they are in Germany, where they are in Canada, where they are in the UK. So they try to create this kind of transnational networking instruments. The fourth is they also use fundraising. You know, they collect money. Some of them even they go to Oxfam, just to give you an example. But there are also many other international NGOs. They go to the UN agencies, so to really raise funding. And the final instrument is that some of them even they went back home. During Corona, some of the medical group, they try to go home. They try to collect, medical equipments. They try to collect hygiene. So in terms of lobby, in terms of humanitarian intervention, of course, this is still a new area that we need to do more research. These are some of the instruments that the diaspora use to contribute, or maybe to anyway emulate the situation back home when disaster happens. In terms of peace building, I just want to let you know that in 2014, we created what we call a Diaspora Academy. And the whole idea of the academy is to support diaspora groups within Europe. They are not only in Holland, but also those who are, wherever they are, within the EU countries, to come to our center, like on peace building, because peace building is a profession, and we adopt what we call it do no harm approach. So we want to make sure diaspora, if they engage in the peace building, then they should not harm the situation. They should try to contribute. So we give them a different tools, how to engage, whom you engage, what kind of instruments you use to engage. And I think that training has been helpful. We even supported diaspora from South Sudan. Even one of them came all the way from America to attend to our training. So, and a lot of them, when they finish our training workshops, then they have sufficient tools to engage in peace building process back home. Because as I said from the beginning, diaspora, although they are far away from home, they are still emotionally attached. And we also what we call, they have this long, and at least we give them information. Take the approach, no harm approach when it comes to peace building. So I want to just finish it here, because my comments were very limited, because then I will give all of you time really to respond